Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst this week's news items we have research into how to make beer taste better. That is, other than not drinking Budweiser. Evidence that GMOs are safe and that we do need them going forwards. An argument that both the debate over GMOs is at an end, and that if you are not pro-GMO, you are pro-Monsanto, and vice versa. A cholera outbreak in Haiti that's proving to be rather nasty. Florida's immunization rates are plummeting. Weird animal research involving monkey brains. Why black holes make light, and how a particular painting used by a professor at a university has led to allegations of Islamophobia. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with how to make beer better, and specifically, how to brew it so that you get better taste. This is rather than the effect that many modern industrial and commercial brewing approaches have. The most notable of these seems to be the way it is fermented. It's done in relatively narrow but very tall tanks. This leads to carbon dioxide being generated in the tank and forcing pressure onto the yeast. This then leads to off flavors, primarily acetate-derived flavors. The researchers figured that if you could find something that was resistant to both CO2 and the pressure from it, you would get better tasting beer. And so they began to look at which strains of yeast were most effective and what exactly was going on at a genetic level. They identified a single regulatory gene that was responsible for the resilience and resistance to CO2. The obvious next step was to take this, copy the gene many times over, and transfer it into other yeast strains, creating what is, for all intents and purposes, a genetically modified strain of the original yeast with better CO2 tolerances. Of course, not everything is sunshine and rainbows. There is a big caveat to the research, but at least the authors are very clear about it. What they did was paid for by a brewing company that wants to patent the technology used and thereby make money that way, along with making whatever it is they're trying to brew. If the idea of brewing doesn't convince you that GMOs are a good thing, then there is an article from the Alliance for Science which lays out what they believe are 5 very solid reasons that the debate over GMOs is at an end. They point out that they're safe, that any conversations around GMOs are shrinking, and what discussion there is nearly always positive, that at least in the younger generations there is greater technological support for GMOs, that farmers are increasingly using them, and that the region with the greatest resistance to GMOs is being eased backwards, that being Europe. Admittedly, there is still one significant holdout, Russia, but Russia's always had an interesting relationship with science. We've previously spoken about the safety of GMOs ourselves in a video that you'll find linked in the top right. The short version of this is that GMOs, as far as the technology is concerned, are safe, more so than any of the more conventional means of generating new varieties of food. The evidence against it is very, very flawed a lot of the time, and in some instances outright improper. As far as younger people are concerned, this is not a horrible new bogeyman which brings fear and worry to the world. Number 4, farmers that are embracing GMOs can be demonstrated no better than in India. Farmers were willingly risking going to jail in order to plant Bt cotton and other vegetables that were genetically modified. This was done for one very simple reason. They could increase their yields by huge margins. And we're not just talking here about the plant yield, but the profit. To use one of the clearest examples, the planting of brinjal eggplants that have been genetically modified to deal with a particular borer more than likely the BT variety of eggplant, meant that they could use 62% less pesticide. This meant that they got 6 times more profit. This is not a small improvement. It is something huge, especially for farmers operating on agricultural systems that don't have the same technological access as places like America and Europe do. In related news that we will link to, there's an interesting argument made in a Forbes article, and it is an old article but worth reading purely because it does present an interesting oxymoron. That is the conflation of Monsanto with GMOs. Monsanto may have some patented or controlled seeds, but the vast majority of their money is not generated from those. Rather, it's being generated by other products, things like pesticides and herbicides. This means that when you both say Monsanto is bad because of GMOs and because of glyphosate, you are in a quandary. They're not the same thing. It is a fair argument to make that if you wanted to make the most money, you would want GMOs that are very controlled and aren't any good more than once, which would be a good argument for why seeds that are patented aren't good. But you'd also want to make it such that you would need to use as much herbicide and pesticide as possible with and around these plants. That means you get the most money every year from the seeds and from the herbicides and pesticides that are made. But that's not what happens here. Rather, genetically modified organisms reduce the need for pesticides and herbicides because you don't need to be anywhere near as careful in timing when it comes to your own plants that you want versus those you want to kill. The same way that the Indian farmers don't need to worry about using anywhere near as much pesticide because the plant generates its own. Conflating the two like this is not helpful, and all it does is muddy the waters about what actually should be discussed, particularly regarding food security and food safety. Going from plants to microorganisms, and specifically cholera in Haiti. At the moment, there is a very, very bad outbreak of cholera in Haiti, and it is killing hundreds of people. Now this, particularly after COVID, may not seem like a very large problem, but remember, cholera is not only able to be kept in the environment for a long time, but it can spread from person to person in a variety of ways. This is somewhat different to something like COVID, where you don't have anything except a person-to-person transmission for the most part. This is why the uncomfortable developments in Haiti are just that. There have been just under 14,000 cases and 300 deaths since October this year. That by itself is uncomfortable, but the current strain of cholera, and much like other diseases there are different strains, is one that is nearly 12 years old at this point and will probably be so very soon. That is all the more awkward when in February of this year, the government declared that the country had been cholera-free and that it was eliminated from the country. This is another concern with this. Remember, we now have it being eliminated from the country, and it had been removed for several years prior to the declaration of elimination. We know that it's a particularly nasty strain from more than 10 years ago, and nobody knows where it came from or why. Mystery diseases are never anyone's idea of fun, except for House. There are several possible reasons as to how and why this has happened. The first is simply that it has been around since 2019, but there were so few cases it was never picked up. That there's some sort of environmental reservoir which has released it, or that there are other countries that have been the source and that one of these countries inadvertently reintroduced cholera somehow, and this would not be the first time that's happened. There isn't a lot that can be done about cholera from a medical point of view. It's better to implement public health measures. For example, sewage systems, proper hand hygiene, avoiding the fecal-oral route, and so on. For other diseases, vaccinations are a perfect and very effective method of preventing the spread of various diseases. This is why Florida in particular is disappointing. just under 92% of their kindergarten-aged children had all of their immunizations for the 2021 to 2022 year. That's not a good number. We've mentioned before that with measles, you need 95% vaccination in order to get herd immunity. Other diseases are similar. If you have less than that, there's a good chance that measles can spread. And when we say 91.7% of children in both public and private schools have all their immunizations, that's a worry. Now, this doesn't mean that they all don't have all of the vaccinations for particular diseases. For instance, 99% of them may have been vaccinated for measles, but not for hepatitis, or similar. It's a very raw rate, so that has to be taken very carefully here. We're assuming all vaccines for all possible conditions for all possible children. Although again, this is Florida, and they probably have more significant concerns than just your run-of-the-mill diseases. Alligators, Florida man, hurricanes, Florida. The list could go on for a while. But this is a low point, and only just above its lowest point before then of 91.3%, so there's a 0.4% before it sets a new record. The vaccines that make up this figure include tetanus, diphtheria, measles, mumps, rubella, influenza, hepatitis B, and polio. Yeah, these aren't the sorts of diseases you want to get for any reason. Tetanus is very nasty. Diphtheria is nasty, but not necessarily life-threatening unless you're young. Measles can have lifelong effects, as do mumps and rubella. Influenza B is just a particularly nasty influenza strain and you don't want it, and this is why the annual influenza vaccine exists. Hepatitis B is forever and can lead to liver issues, and then you have polio, which can prevent you from walking due to paralysis. So Florida may need to start adding these diseases to its list of notable Floridian traits, such as Florida man, going from medical news that is arguably avoidable to an interesting but seemingly ignorant article that asks why cardiac injuries are rising in the United States of America, France, Israel, and Germany. The short version of their introduction is that they view the impact of myocarditis as being serious, and it is. They then say that there is an age group that personally affects them and puts them at a high risk, and that if they had it, they feel it's going to severely impact on them personally. They describe 4 to 6 months of no physical activity and multiple medications and unknown long-term damage as all concerns, which is perfectly reasonable. Again, nothing they say at this point is a worry. What is an issue is that they do two things. One, they immediately associate this increased risk with being vaccinated. Second, that while they say that severe infection with COVID-19 can cause this, that they still think it's related to the vaccines. Yeah. They seem to think that because they're at a higher risk, being in the right age group for the vaccines that are based on mRNA technology to cause this for them, they should be more vociferous about their concerns. The article also has issues to do with what they're saying as far as time goes. They explain that research pointed out that there was a sharp rise in the first year of the pandemic, that being more than 2 years ago now. But now there's a difference in that there is a 1/3 rise in the lowest group that's at risk of myocarditis. This doesn't account for the increased prevalence of COVID-19, that there are newer strains which are acting very differently, and that this may explain it but isn't actually addressed, which would be important. If, as the author seems to want to put forward, that vaccines were the leading cause of this, you would expect to see a commensurate increase in this. As the prevalence of vaccinations goes up, so should the prevalence of myocarditis. But we don't see that. We see a much longer term, lower level general trend up, which would match with more and more people being infected with newer strains of COVID-19. They have tried to generate a sort of time series, but then they've chosen to cherry pick particular dates and timeframes and ignore other data that plays into this. For example, they say, since vaccines were widely administered last year, myocarditis rates surged more than 75%. One might speculate that severe COVID illness accounts for the rise, except myocarditis cases dropped at the start of the COVID pandemic, and kept declining for a few months afterwards. Only shortly before, in their article, they did point out that the authors did find a 14% rise in heart attacks in the first year of the pandemic, signaling COVID infections in severely ill patients. Postponed doctors' visits, lockdown measures, and other various factors played a contributing role. These two clearly are contrarian positions to take if you're going to try and claim one and the other at the same time, as they have. You need to put it in context of, yes, you had a decrease because people weren't being diagnosed. The article also fails to address one of the big problems in what they're saying. They make the case that in 2021 there was a sharp increase in myocarditis cases. They say that there's a 31% increase, which is a serious number. But they also don't address the fact that in 2021 there was a substantial and continuous rise in myocarditis. In 2022, that number skyrocketed even further as restrictions were eased. There is a very clear reason why we see a significant increase. The first is that, yes, to some extent, COVID-19 vaccines can cause myocarditis, can cause, and in limited cases. The actual risks of this are considerably lower than what are being presented, but it is possible. Conversely, there is a significant increase in risk of myocarditis after infection with COVID-19, and that there is, despite the reality of the vaccines, still a risk of developing it even if you are vaccinated. This means that, yeah, you would expect to see a significant increase as the prevalence of COVID-19 rises, and as more people are vaccinated. Where there is a risk, you will see an increase in the thing that is a risk, increase in prevalence as it's given to more people. This is what a reality brings. You can't simply say, oh, only so many people have it, and that's all there will ever be. No, you give out more of the vaccine to more people, the more of the people who will exhibit a symptom, whether that is myocarditis, a rash, or simply having an unpleasant day when they feel like crap. This article does not draw the right comparisons in the right way, and it's not a problem limited to only this author. Even the Washington Post manages to make the same kind of not just screw up, but spectacular screw up. What they've done is, at one point, claimed COVID is no longer mainly a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Here's why. And then they changed the title of the article because, well, they're idiots. They try and justify that more people are getting COVID if they are vaccinated than those who are not vaccinated. As they try to open their article with 58% of coronavirus deaths in August were from people who were vaccinated or boosted. Yes, that is what you would expect to see when so many of the population are fully vaccinated. 69% of US adults are fully vaccinated, but less than 68% of them are dying. This means there are fewer deaths amongst the vaccinated cohort than the unvaccinated cohort. To put this another way, 31% of the US adult population is not fully vaccinated. Despite this, they make up 42% of the deaths. If you had an assortment of fruit where the vaccinated individuals are apples, and you had 7 of these, and you had 3 oranges to represent the individuals who are not vaccinated, You would need to take away 4 of the apples that represent the individuals who have been fully vaccinated. You would also need to take away 1.5 of the oranges representing the unvaccinated individuals. When you look at it this way, you can see you have taken away much more of the oranges than you have the apples. And this demonstrates that the Washington Post does not understand the very basic statistics where you try and compare the things to each other in a way where you have an appropriate percentage and ratio. Not simply saying that, well, we have 10 pieces of fruit in total. No, how much of the is made up of each different thing. And this is why the article is such a fundamental failure of basic statistics. Going from evidence that humans should never be allowed to leave this planet to research that might just let that happen. It's an experiment looking at brain switching that could theoretically be useful for space travel, but we are nowhere near that yet, so currently they're using monkeys. The gist of what they've done is take monkeys and chemically induce a state of hypothermia. By doing that, they could then store them long term. Using hypothermia is the same sort of approach as other animals use for hibernation. It reduces all the metabolic processes to the lowest level required to keep the organism alive, and then allows them to come back out of that state. This is what the researchers were trying to do when they took the monkeys and basically drugged them to try and generate the same sort of state. In other space-related news, we have an interesting article on just how it is that a black hole generates some of the most powerful light in the universe. A black hole, by its very nature, is meant to draw all light into it, and by doing so, it creates a black hole, hence the name. The research indicates that as everything is gradually pulled into the black hole, it builds up speed and power. Once it gets to the center, it is destroyed and turned into energy, and that this energy is shot out in lines that are very much like a cross shape, where you have the horizontal plane being the material that the black hole is sucking in, and the vertical plane being where the energy is released from. The final item we have for you this week is all about a incident involving an academic who was teaching. They were at Hamline University, and the short summary of events is that they teach on the history of art. This isn't exactly a particularly useful degree to have or unit to study, but there's something for everybody. The lecturer showed a picture of Mohammed and was describing it as a masterpiece. It would seem perfectly reasonable to praise the idea of good art, no matter what the content is in terms of historical figures, whether that is, for example, the roof of the Sistine Chapel or the stained glass windows of Notre Dame. So far, everything the lecturer was doing seems to have been in praise or at least positivity about Muhammad and the image. Yet, for some reason, it has been listed as an act of Islamophobia, a hate crime. Understand, this particular example was not a requisite. It was an optional class where they would knowingly look at the image and they would know about it. An optional visual analysis and discussion of a famous medieval Islamic painting of the Prophet Muhammad is how it was titled. This is not something someone's going to wander into with ignorance. They know exactly what's happening and still complained. The article from New Lines magazine goes into great detail on just why this isn't Islamophobic and about the picture itself that was the crux of all of this. But they do make one particular point that's worth reiterating. The image in question was made by Muslims for Muslims in studying their religious text and traditions. It is arguably the most possible pro-Muslim and anti-Islamophobic image that could be used and is entirely within the confines of what the religion considers reasonable. In fact, it is effectively a religious image made in the style of and per religious rules. The whole situation is insanity. By its very nature, punishing an academic for doing something that is perfectly within their purview and is accepted as an appropriate practice within the religion, and then claiming it is Islamophobic or anti-religious, is insanity itself. Further to that insanity, there is also questions around whether or not there's a certain degree of academic freedom that should not have been taken away with this, more so for the fact that it was optional, and everybody who involved themselves in it knew what was going to happen. And then somebody complained because they weren't happy about something that shouldn't be a problem. It cost the academic their job, and although yes, they are an arts academic, they shouldn't lose their job for nothing. They should lose their job because the arts are a complete waste of time, money, and effort. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.